The air felt different that morning. Too still, like something heavy pressed against the room, though none of us dared to name it. It was my birthday, and the living room was decorated with the same tired streamers we'd used for years. The fireplace crackled warmly, and the scent of cake baking drifted from the kitchen. It was all familiar, all the same, yet beneath it, a chill lingered, one that had nothing to do with the weather outside. It was the kind of chill that came from knowing, with absolute certainty, that I was about to be reminded of my place in the family hierarchy again. Mom stood there in her favorite apron, grinning like she'd just won the lottery. She had that proud, glowing expression she reserved for only one person in this house, Lily. She handed Lily a small box wrapped in silver paper, tied with a delicate ribbon. I watched as Lily peeled back the wrapping with her perfectly manicured nails, her lips already forming an exaggerated "oh my God" before she'd even seen what was inside. She always did that, played up every reaction like we were in some over-the-top TV drama with the cameras rolling. Then she opened it. Inside was a key, a simple silver key nestled in a velvet-lined box. Lily's eyes widened, her entire face lighting up like she'd been handed the keys to the kingdom. And in a way, she had, because that key didn't open a jewelry box or a new car in the driveway. It opened the front door to a whole damn house. If you love stories of resilience, reclaiming justice with style, and rediscovering your worth, hit that subscribe button for Graceful Revenge now. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Let's dive into the power of elegant revenge and life's deepest lessons together. "We bought her a house," Mom announced, her voice trembling with pride, as if she'd just declared Lily had cured cancer or discovered the secret to eternal youth. My stomach twisted. Dad nodded in solemn agreement, his face set like this was some sacred family rite of passage. Lily let out a high-pitched squeal, throwing her arms around both of them, her voice a chorus of, "Oh my God, thank you, thank you, thank you," like a wind-up toy stuck on repeat. And me? I just sat there. My own gift rested on my lap. An envelope, thin, unimpressive, barely worth the effort of wrapping. Dad had handed it to me right after Lily's grand moment. An afterthought. No applause, no excitement, just a quiet "here." I could feel my pulse in my ears as I slid my finger under the seal, pulling out a single sheet of paper. I didn't even look at it right away. I just sat there, staring at the envelope in my hands, already knowing what it meant, already knowing what it said about me. This wasn't just my birthday. It was tradition. A tradition where Lily got castles and I got crumbs. A tradition where my place was always in the background. As I finally unfolded the paper, I felt that old familiar weight settle onto my chest, the same weight I'd carried my entire life. But what they didn't know, what they could never suspect, was that this year would be different. This year, I had a plan. I sat there, staring at the thin, unimpressive slip of paper resting in my lap, my fingers tightening around its edges as the weight of the moment pressed down. Around me, the room still hummed with Lily's excitement, her voice high-pitched with disbelief, her perfectly manicured fingers clutching the tiny silver key like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Oh my God, you bought me a house," she kept repeating, her voice filled with rehearsed wonder. The same way she'd performed every big reaction since we were kids, as if we lived inside some scripted family drama where she was the star. My mother dabbed at her eyes, nodding proudly, while my father stood beside her, nodding in solemn agreement, the two of them wrapped in the warm glow of their own generosity. "She deserves it," my mother said, her voice trembling with the weight of self-congratulation. That was the moment something inside me twisted so sharply it almost made me dizzy. I swallowed hard, fingers sliding under the seal of my envelope as I carefully unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. I knew even before reading it that it would be meaningless. A token gesture, maybe a check for a few hundred, maybe a forced sentiment scribbled onto a pre-written card. It didn't matter, because this wasn't about the gift. This wasn't even about Lily. It was about what it had always been about: who mattered and who didn't. The memories pressed in before I could stop them, old wounds splitting open like they'd been waiting for this moment to remind me of their existence. My 9th birthday, the night before, I'd stayed up late baking my own cupcakes, carefully frosting them under the dim kitchen light, while Mom sighed impatiently, glancing at the clock because Lily had a ballet rehearsal early the next morning and she didn't want to be late. I went to bed that night buzzing with excitement, thinking maybe this year would be different. Maybe I'd wake up to a celebration, to a kitchen filled with laughter and balloons and the smell of pancakes. But when I tiptoed downstairs, the house was quiet. No card, no wrapped presents waiting on the counter, just the faint smell of burnt toast and my mother sipping coffee while she checked the schedule for Lily's rehearsal. My high school science fair, I'd spent weeks perfecting my project, a fully functional hydroelectric dam model that impressed my teachers so much they encouraged me to enter it into the state competition. The night I won first place, I looked out into the audience, scanning the crowd for a familiar face, but my parents weren't there. Dad had a golf game he couldn't reschedule. Mom had to drive Lily to a last-minute audition. They sent a congratulatory text. One line, no punctuation, no exclamation marks. But when Lily landed a role in a shampoo commercial a few weeks later, they threw a dinner party in her honor, invited the neighbors, popped champagne, and framed the product shot in the hallway like it was a Pulitzer. The night of the Academic Scholarship Awards, my name was called, my heart pounded, and I walked onto that stage, feeling for the first time in my life like I'd done something big enough to be seen. The applause was deafening. My teachers beamed with pride, my classmates clapped, and there, sitting in the front row, was my mother. Not clapping, not smiling, scrolling through her phone. When I stepped off the stage, award in hand, she barely glanced up. "Well, at least you're good at something," she muttered, loud enough for people around us to hear, her voice slicing through the applause like a blade. I used to think I was being sensitive, that maybe I was overreacting, but moments like this, the silver key in Lily's hands, the meaningless slip of paper in mine, reminded me that I wasn't crazy. This was real, and it had always been real. 2 weeks later, I found myself driving back to my parents' house, not because I wanted to, but because my mother had called me twice in 1 week, her voice heavy with the kind of guilt she wielded like a weapon. "Your father pulled a muscle mowing the lawn. We need help moving some things. It would be nice if you actually came home once in a while." She didn't ask about my job, my life, my health. She didn't care. The only thing that mattered was that I played my role. The reliable, disposable daughter who showed up when needed and disappeared when she wasn't. The house looked the same. Too perfect, too curated. A museum of a life that had never really included me. The same framed photos of Lily lined the walls, her achievements frozen in time, her face beaming in every stage picture. Lily wasn't there, of course. She was busy. The visit was uneventful. I helped my father move some boxes in the garage while he grumbled about how he wasn't as young as he used to be. I sat through dinner while my mother complained about Lily's boyfriend, her voice laced with frustration as she sighed dramatically. "He's just not ambitious enough." They spent the rest of the meal discussing their latest home renovation plans, particularly the family's beloved lakehouse, a place they talked about with such reverence you'd think it was some kind of sacred inheritance. They never once asked about me, never asked about my life, never even pretended to care. By Saturday night, I was restless. I wandered the halls, the weight of childhood pressing down on me in a way that made it hard to breathe. My old bedroom felt foreign, filled with trophies and books no one had ever acknowledged, a relic of a life I'd worked so hard to escape. That's when I saw it, the office door slightly ajar. That wasn't unusual, but the wall safe, the one my father had always treated like some sacred, untouchable relic, was open. I froze. Dad never left that thing open. He checked and rechecked every lock in the house before bed, like a ritual. Something was wrong. I stepped inside the office, the smell of dust and old paper thick in the air. The safe door was just barely open, the handle hanging loose. My heart pounded as I stepped closer. I knew I shouldn't look. I knew I should turn around and pretend I hadn't seen it, but I didn't. My fingers curled around the edge of the safe door, pulling it open a little more. Inside were neatly stacked folders, tax forms, property deeds, bank statements, the usual. And then, beneath a stack of paperwork, I saw it. An envelope, sealed, unmarked except for one thing. A handwritten note in my father's blocky script, to be opened upon death. My hands trembled as I reached for it. My breath caught in my throat. I shouldn't have opened it, but I did. Inside was a copy of a will, not the one I'd seen years ago, the one where my father had made a grand show of fairness, splitting everything evenly. No, this was different. My name was listed first, not Lily's, and not just as an equal beneficiary. Attached to my name was a property, a house, one I'd never heard of before, bought years ago under my name, and I'd never been told. I flipped through the documents, my hands shaking, scanning the details, looking for some kind of explanation, but the further I read, the worse it got. There were bank transactions tied to my name, transactions I'd never authorized. And then I found it. A forged signature. Mine. Someone had been using my name, moving money, hiding assets, and based on the paperwork, this wasn't the first time. My stomach twisted as realization set in. This wasn't just favoritism. This was something else entirely. And for the first time in my life, I had power. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dim glow of my childhood bedroom, the papers spread out in front of me, the weight of the discovery pressing down on my chest like a lead blanket. My mind raced, flipping through memories, scanning every interaction, every conversation, every offhand comment my parents had ever made about finances. How long had this been happening? Why had they done it? And more importantly, why had they hidden it from me? I flipped back to the deed, running my fingers over my own name printed clearly on the document. The house existed. It was real. And according to the records, it had been purchased nearly 5 years ago, quietly tucked away under my name while they continued parading Lily around as the golden child. My stomach churned. It didn't make sense. If they were so obsessed with Lily, if they'd spent our entire lives making sure she had the best of everything, why was my name on this? Why had they spent years pretending I was insignificant while secretly securing assets in my name? I sifted through the rest of the documents. Bank transfers, asset reallocations, even loans taken out under my name, all without my knowledge. Some of them went back a decade. And then I saw it. A signature, my name scribbled at the bottom of an authorization form, except it wasn't mine. The realization sent a sharp electric shock through my spine. Someone had forged my signature. Someone had been moving money in my name, And based on the details, it wasn't just a one-time thing. It had been happening for years. I sat there staring at the papers, my pulse pounding in my ears, the betrayal sinking into my bones. I'd spent years believing I was invisible, believing they'd cast me aside without a second thought. But this wasn't just neglect. This was something else entirely. And suddenly, I understood. Lily was their star, their carefully curated masterpiece, the daughter they'd molded, polished, and presented to the world. But I was something else. I wasn't invisible, I was useful. I'd always been the responsible one, the one who never got into trouble, the one who never asked for much. I was the safe bet, the insurance policy, the name they could use when they needed a safety net, and they'd never planned on me finding out. I pressed my fingers against my temples, forcing myself to breathe. The realization settled into my skin, cold and unshakable. For years, I'd played the part. The quiet one, the easy one, the daughter who never made waves, never asked for more, never demanded to be seen. But that was over, because for the first time in my life, I had power, and I was going to use it. The next morning, I left before breakfast. My mother barely looked up from her coffee when I muttered an excuse about work, her only response a distracted drive safe. My father nodded, still half asleep, never suspecting that just hours earlier, I'd been sitting in his office, unraveling the carefully constructed financial web he'd spent years building. I drove back to my apartment in silence, my mind a whirlwind of calculations, possibilities, and cold, sharp intentions. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to confront them. That wasn't the way to win. If they'd spent years believing I was insignificant, then that was exactly what I was going to let them keep believing. I spent the next 2 months preparing. First, I contacted a lawyer, someone I trusted, someone who wouldn't flinch when I slid the stack of documents across the table and said, "Tell me exactly how much trouble they could be in." We combed through everything, every forged signature, every unauthorized transfer, every quiet financial decision that had been made without my knowledge. The deeper we dug, the uglier it got. And then we found it. The lakehouse, the one they'd been gushing about over dinner, the one they'd been renovating for years, pouring money into like it was their greatest treasure. Except there was a problem. They'd mortgaged it, not just once. 3 years ago, my father had taken out a massive loan against the house to cover a failed business venture. Lily's failed business venture. She'd tried to launch a clothing line. It had flopped spectacularly. Rather than let their golden child face the consequences, my parents had quietly cleaned up the mess, pulling money from wherever they could to pay off her debts. But they'd fallen behind. The bank had been patient for a while, but the payments had continued to slip, and by the time I found out about it, the house was already on the auction list. That was when I made my move. I didn't warn them. I didn't confront them. I simply bought it, legally, quietly, through a third party. It took a few weeks to orchestrate, a few more to finalize the paperwork, but when it was done, when I held the deed in my hands, the satisfaction that flooded through me was indescribable. Because I hadn't just taken their beloved lake house, I'd taken the one thing they never thought they could lose. And they had no idea. I played my part well. When Mom called to complain about financial stress, I made all the right sympathetic noises. When Dad forwarded me job listings with, "Thought this might be more your speed," in the subject line, I responded politely. When Lily sent voice notes about her latest exciting project, I listened. And I waited for the perfect moment, waited for my next birthday. Because if they'd spent my entire life using that day to remind me of my place, then it was only fair that I used it to remind them of theirs. My next birthday arrived, and with it, the same tired script. Lily received a designer handbag. Mom gushed over her perfect little angel. Dad beamed with that look of indulgent pride he reserved only for her. And then it was my turn. I handed my father a small, unremarkable white box. No ribbon, no decorations, just clean, sharp edges, and the weight of something far heavier than they could ever anticipate. He laughed, shaking it slightly, throwing Lily a smug grin. "Feels light. You didn't get me socks, did you?" I smiled. "Just open it." He did. Inside was an envelope, a single ivory-colored envelope, thick and expensive, with an embossed seal pressed neatly across the flap. His laughter faltered slightly as he unfolded the papers inside. His eyes scanned the first few lines, his face shifting from amusement to confusion, then realization, then panic. His breath hitched, his fingers tightened around the pages. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Mom leaned over his shoulder, eyes narrowing, her expression still hovering somewhere between mild annoyance and curiosity. But as her gaze landed on the document's bolded header, her lips parted slightly, her face draining of color. Lily, still oblivious, took another sip of her drink. "What is it?" I watched them, watched it sink in, and then I said the words I'd waited my entire life to say. "I own the lakehouse now." Silence, thick, dense, absolute. I leaned back in my chair, my smile soft. "Happy birthday to me." The silence that followed was so absolute, so deafening, that for a moment I wondered if time itself had stopped. My father sat frozen, gripping the paper so tightly his knuckles had gone white. My mother, still leaning over his shoulder, was rapidly scanning the document, as if by reading it fast enough, she could somehow rewrite what was in front of her. Lily, completely oblivious, let out a small laugh, stirring her drink, her polished nails clinking lightly against the glass. "Wait, what? What do you mean you own the lakehouse?" She looked between us, waiting for someone to fill in the blanks, waiting for our parents to reassure her, waiting for this to be some elaborate joke. But no one spoke. No one moved. And then, finally, my father inhaled sharply, sitting up straighter, his expression shifting from shock to something colder, sharper, anger laced with desperation. This isn't possible," he muttered, flipping through the papers as if a different answer might appear on the next page. "The bank. No, this is a mistake." I tilted my head slightly, watching him. "No, it's not." My voice was calm, steady. I'd rehearsed this moment in my head 1,000 times. The reveal, the reaction, the realization. And now, seeing it unfold exactly as I'd imagined, there was something almost surreal about it. My mother let out a small, sharp breath. You bought it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded. "Through a third party, months ago, legally." My father shook his head rapidly. No, we just needed more time." I let out a small, humorless laugh. "More time?" The bank didn't think so. Lily frowned, still trying to catch up. "But I thought the renovations were almost done. You said we'd have it ready by summer." Mom turned to me, her face tight, her voice dropping into the controlled, almost motherly tone she always used when she wanted to make me feel guilty. "You don't understand, sweetheart. That house, it was always meant to stay in the family." I raised an eyebrow. "The family? You mean Lily's family?" Her mouth opened, then closed. And there it was. That single second of hesitation, that flicker of truth in her eyes. Because deep down, we all knew what she'd really meant. Lily's, not mine. "Why would you do this?" my father asked, his voice strained, a mix of frustration and disbelief. "Why would you go behind our backs like this?" Something in me snapped. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, my eyes locking onto his. "Why?" I repeated, my voice quiet but razor sharp. "Do you really want to ask me that? After everything?" He flinched, just slightly, but I saw it. I inhaled deeply, my fingers digging into my palms beneath the table. "You spent years making me feel like I was nothing, like I was just some background character in my own damn life. Every time Lily won, you celebrated. Every time I won, you barely noticed. And I took it. I swallowed it down and convinced myself it didn't matter." I leaned back, my voice colder now. "But it did matter, and you knew it. And still, you never stopped." Lily blinked rapidly, shaking her head. "This isn't fair. That house was—" I cut her off before she could finish. "That house was never yours. Not legally. And now it's definitely not yours." She made a strangled noise in the back of her throat, turning to our parents, waiting for them to fix it. "Mom? Dad? You can do something, right?" But they were silent. And I saw it in their eyes then. The same realization I'd come to months ago. They'd lost. Not just the house. Everything. The fallout happened in slow motion. Dad's first instinct was denial. He spent the next 20 minutes flipping through the paperwork, rereading the same sentences over and over, his hands shaking as if he could undo what was already set in stone. Then came anger. He slammed the papers onto the table, his voice rising. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you have any idea what that house meant to this family?" "This family?" I echoed, my tone cutting. "You mean the family that used my name to take out loans without my permission? The family that forged my signature on financial documents? That family?" Mom flinched. Lily paled. And then, finally, acceptance. The moment Dad realized this wasn't something he could talk his way out of. No matter how much he pleaded, how much he rationalized, how much he tried to guilt me, the house was gone, and I was the one who owned it. The conversation turned desperate. "We can fix this," Mom said, reaching for my hand, her voice gentle now, coaxing, like I was a child she could still manipulate. "We can figure something out, maybe a trade." I pulled my hand away before she could touch me. "No." She blinked. "No?" I shook my head slowly, my voice unwavering. "You don't get to negotiate with me, not anymore." Lily scoffed. "Jesus, you're being dramatic. It's just a house." I turned to her, and for the first time in my life, I saw her for exactly what she was. Not a golden child, not some larger-than-life figure I'd spent years resenting, just small. A girl who'd spent her entire life expecting the world to bend for her. A girl who, for the first time, had been told no. I let out a slow breath, standing up. "Enjoy the rest of the party." Mom stepped forward quickly. "Wait!" I picked up my coat. Dad clenched his jaw, his expression hard. "You walk out that door, you're not welcome here anymore." I smiled. I was never welcome here to begin with. And with that, I turned and walked out, stepping into the cool evening air, the breeze sharp against my skin as I pulled the door shut behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't walking away from something. I was walking toward it. That night, I sat in the lakehouse, curled up in an armchair by the window, a glass of wine in my hand as I watched the moonlight reflect off the still water. The house was silent, peaceful, mine. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain from my body, feeling something I'd never felt before. Not happiness, not triumph, but something quieter. Peace. I wasn't interested in closure. I wasn't interested in revenge. I'd simply taken back what had always been stolen from me. And for the first time in my life, I was finally free. The lake house was quiet, the kind of quiet that settled deep into your bones, pressing into every corner of the space like a long forgotten memory. I sat by the window, a blanket draped over my shoulders, a glass of wine resting against my palm, watching the stars shimmer over the calm lake, a stark contrast to the storm I'd left behind. For the first time in my life, I was alone, and yet I'd never felt less alone than I did in that moment. The silence wasn't heavy, it wasn't suffocating, it didn't carry the weight of expectations or the sting of neglect. It was just peaceful. And that was the strangest part of it all, because for so long, I'd convinced myself that what I wanted, what I needed, was some kind of reckoning, a confrontation that would finally force them to see me, to acknowledge me, to understand everything they'd done. But now, sitting here in this house that was mine, the idea of closure felt almost laughable. There was no closure because there'd never been anything to close. They'd made their choice. They'd spent years showing me exactly who they were, exactly what I meant to them, and for too long, I'd let myself believe that if I just tried harder, if I just earned it, one day they'd love me the way they loved Lily. But love, real love, wasn't something you had to earn. And that was what had set me free. I took another slow sip of my wine, my fingers tracing absent patterns along the rim of the glass, my mind drifting back to the moment I'd left the house, the look on my father's face, the sharp edge of betrayal in my mother's eyes, the stunned silence from Lily as she realized, maybe for the first time in her life, that she wasn't untouchable. That moment should have felt like a victory, but it didn't. Because this was never about revenge. This was about taking back what was mine. And I had. The fallout was inevitable. A week passed before my mother called. I didn't answer. Then another, then another. The voicemails piled up, each one more desperate than the last. "We need to talk. Your father is devastated. I don't understand why you're doing this." Each message was laced with something she'd spent years perfecting. The ability to twist the situation into something that made her the victim. She wasn't calling because she cared. She was calling because, for the first time, I'd done something they couldn't control. The next call was from my father. I didn't listen to it. Then Lily, that one I played. Her voice was sharp, clipped, none of the usual honey sweetness she used when she wanted something. "You really think this makes you special? You think this makes you the winner? Fine, take the stupid house, but don't expect anyone to come crawling back to you when you realize how miserable you are alone." I smiled, because that was the thing she'd never understand. I wasn't miserable. For the first time, I was free. I deleted the message. A month passed, then 2, then 3. I didn't reach out. They didn't either, or at least not in any way that mattered. The calls slowed, the emails dwindled. The only time I heard about them was through mutual acquaintances, neighbors, distant relatives. The occasional slip of conversation in places they didn't expect me to hear. They were struggling. The renovations had drained more money than they'd let on. The lake house had been their final safety net, the thing they'd banked on to keep themselves afloat. Without it, the cracks were starting to show. Dad was furious. Mom was trying to hold everything together. Lily had convinced herself this was temporary, that someone would come along and fix it for her. And me? I didn't care, because their problems weren't mine anymore. I spent my days in the lake house, fixing the small things, repairing what needed to be repaired, letting the place become something real instead of just an investment. A project my parents had poured money into, but never truly loved. I found pieces of them everywhere. The faded outlines of old furniture on the wooden floors, the chipped paint in the hallway where Lily had once thrown a tantrum so loud the neighbors had called to check in. But I also found myself here, in the way the house settled at night, quiet but never empty, in the way the sun streamed through the windows in the morning, spilling warmth onto the kitchen floor, in the way the air smelled different here, cleaner, sharper, like it had been waiting all these years for someone to finally breathe it in. I wasn't lonely. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't waiting for an apology that would never come, because the truth was, I'd already won. Not because I'd taken the house, not because I'd outsmarted them, but because I'd finally stopped waiting for them to love me. And that was worth more than anything they'd ever given Lily, more than any house, more than any inheritance. Because this wasn't just about money, it was about power. And for the first time in my life, I was the one holding it. I never saw them again. Not really. Years passed. The occasional email would find its way into my inbox, an impersonal, forced, "Hope you're doing well," followed by a passive-aggressive, "It would be nice to hear from you." I never replied. Lily moved on. Mom still told people she had 2 daughters, though I'm sure in the privacy of her own mind, she only counted 1. Dad never forgave me, and I never cared. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't about them. It was about me and the life I'd built away from their expectations, away from their control, away from the small, suffocating box they'd tried to shove me into my entire life. The lake house was mine. My life was mine. And for the first time in forever, I was exactly where I was meant to be. The wind rustled outside, the lake still and dark under the night sky. I wrapped the blanket tighter around myself, watching as the world settled into its quiet stillness, the house creaking gently in response to the evening chill. This was home now, not because of the walls or the furniture or the memories, but because I'd made it mine. And as I sat there, staring out at the endless stretch of water, I realized something I'd never let myself believe before. I'd never needed them. Not then, not now, not ever. And that was the most freeing thing of all. There are moments in life when we find ourselves standing at a crossroads, forced to choose between what we've always known and what we truly deserve. This story is not just about revenge or financial maneuvering. It's about something much deeper. The realization of self-worth, the courage to walk away, and the undeniable power that comes with finally choosing yourself over the expectations of others. The lessons embedded in this journey are universal, applicable to anyone who's ever felt overlooked, undervalued, or underestimated. It's about breaking free from the narratives imposed upon us and reclaiming control over our own lives. One of the most profound lessons in the story is that we don't have to accept the roles assigned to us by others. For years, I lived under the shadow of my sister, watching as my efforts were dismissed, my achievements minimized, and my worth reduced to an afterthought. I was conditioned to believe that my place was in the background, that my needs and desires were secondary to those of my family's golden child. And yet, despite this conditioning, there was always a small voice inside me that questioned it, that whispered, "This isn't right, this isn't fair." But when you grow up in an environment where love is conditional and approval is selectively granted, you learn to silence that voice, convincing yourself that maybe you're just being overly sensitive, that maybe you should just be grateful for what little you're given. But the truth is, you're not obligated to shrink yourself to make others comfortable. There's no honor in staying silent while others take from you, manipulate you, and dismiss your existence as something inconsequential. My decision to fight back wasn't driven by vengeance, but by clarity. The realization that I had power, that I wasn't just a passive player in their game, but someone who could change the rules entirely. This leads to the second powerful lesson. Sometimes, silence is the loudest form of power. When we think of revenge, we often picture dramatic confrontations, explosive arguments, and moments of fiery retribution. But real power, real revenge, it often comes in the form of quiet, deliberate action. I never screamed at my family. I never begged for their love. I never lashed out or broke down in tears, demanding to be treated fairly. Instead, I planned. I watched. I waited. And when the time came, I delivered my final move with precision, with calm detachment, with the understanding that true victory doesn't come from proving your worth to people who never valued you, but from removing yourself entirely from their grasp. Revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes it's about taking back control. I didn't destroy them. I simply reclaimed what was already mine. I didn't go out of my way to ruin their lives. I simply removed myself from the equation, forcing them to confront the consequences of their own actions. And that was more powerful than any heated argument, any dramatic showdown, any desperate plea for recognition. Another vital lesson is that people will always try to rewrite the story, to paint themselves as the victim. The moment my family realized they'd lost, they didn't reflect on their own mistakes. They didn't acknowledge their years of neglect, their blatant favoritism, their financial manipulation. Instead, they played the victim. How could you do this to us? Why would you betray your own family? We just needed more time. This is a common reaction from those who've spent their lives taking without consequence. They're not upset because they've been wronged. They're upset because they're no longer in control. When people have benefited from your silence, they'll always frame your voice as an act of aggression. When people have profited from your compliance, they'll see your resistance as cruelty. But you're not responsible for their discomfort. You're not responsible for making them feel better about the harm they've caused. This is where another fundamental truth emerges. You don't owe anyone an explanation for choosing yourself. When I walked out of that house, I didn't justify my actions. I didn't defend myself against their accusations. I didn't try to make them understand, because understanding was never the point. They'd never understand because they'd never cared to. The moment you stop seeking validation from people who've built their entire lives around dismissing you, you win. Not because they finally see your worth, but because you finally see it for yourself. Letting go is often framed as weakness. Society teaches us that family is everything, that blood is thicker than water, that we must endure, forgive, and tolerate, no matter how deeply we're hurt. But what happens when family is the source of your pain? What happens when the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally are the ones who make you feel the most unworthy? The answer is simple. You walk away. And not just physically. You walk away emotionally, mentally, spiritually. You stop waiting for them to change. You stop waiting for the apology that will never come. You stop replaying old conversations in your head, trying to figure out what you could have done differently. You stop hoping for a different version of them to show up at your door. Because at the end of the day, your life isn't a courtroom, and you don't need to build a case to justify your freedom. Some people will never admit their mistakes. Some people will never give you closure. And that's okay. Closure isn't something that's given to you by others. It's something you give to yourself when you finally decide that their absence hurts less than their presence. This brings us to perhaps the most liberating truth of all. You don't need permission to be happy. For so long, my life had been defined by waiting to be seen, waiting to be loved, waiting for the moment when I'd finally be enough. And when that moment never came, I convinced myself that maybe it was because I hadn't tried hard enough, that maybe if I just achieved more, worked harder, made myself smaller, more palatable, more digestible, then maybe, just maybe, they'd finally give me the approval I'd spent my entire life chasing. But the most painful lesson I learned was that some people will never love you the way you need them to. And that's not your fault. It's not because you're unworthy. It's not because you did something wrong. It's simply because they're incapable of giving you what you deserve. And when you finally accept that, when you finally stop trying to make them into something they'll never be, you set yourself free. Because happiness isn't something that's granted to you by others. It's not something you have to earn through suffering, or something that only exists once you've proven yourself worthy of it. Happiness is something you create for yourself, on your own terms, in your own time. And the moment you stop waiting for permission to live your life is the moment you truly begin to live it. I didn't need them to apologize. I didn't need them to change. I didn't need them to recognize my worth. I just needed to recognize it myself. And once I did, once I finally stopped waiting, once I finally let go, I won. Not in the way they would have defined victory, not in a way that required their acknowledgement, but in a way that mattered. I was free. And that was worth more than anything they could have ever given me.